Hello, and welcome back to yet another retro channel. Today I decided to do a follow-up video to the video I recently released regarding the Tandy TRS-80 Color Computer 1 and improving its video. As a part of that process, I recapped that motherboard. Now, there is an ongoing debate as to the value of recapping. I'm going to put my 2 cents in, but I don't expect anybody to take this as anything other than just my opinion. I'm no electronics expert. I have no formal training in this. I just know what I've picked up over the years. But the debate seems to focus mostly on electrolytic capacitors. And these are electrolytic capacitors that I pulled from that Coco yesterday. Other types of capacitors can be recapped as well, although in some cases I don't see any value in it. A ceramic disc capacitor, for instance, those virtually never go bad. However, there are some types that you want to almost always recap. Safety caps in power supplies. You may have heard of REFA caps. What those are safety caps that ride the mains input to filter out electromagnetic and radio frequency interference before the power gets to the transformer. Those safety caps, they're called safety caps because there are two specific types, the X caps and the Y caps, and they are designed so that if they fail open. And the reason for that is to protect your equipment and to protect, more importantly, to protect you. For instance, one of those caps may be tied between the live and the earth ground, which is usually mounted to the chassis of the power supply, and that can often be metal. So if that cap fails short, then it's going to pass live mains voltage to the case, and if you touch the case in that instance, you could be electrocuted. So those safety caps, their purpose is to protect the user, and in smaller part to protect the equipment. There were caps made by a company called REFA that are notorious for failing, and when they fail, they release the magic smoke. So although they're, when they properly fail, they fail open so as to protect the user. They can make a mess. They release that nasty smoke. They release some materials that can contaminate your board, can cause corrosion and other things. So almost always, if you open up a power supply and see REFA safety caps, you want to replace those. Replace them with a modern equivalent X or Y capacitor, depending on which position it's in. Another type of capacitor that is a common failure point is the tantalum dipped capacitor. Tantalum capacitors, when they fail, they will also often release the magic smoke, although they're usually tiny little capacitors, so they don't have a lot of smoke to let go. However, those usually sit on the 5 or 12 volt rail in your PC, and if they fail, they usually fail short, which means you have a short on that power rail. And in a lot of cases, particularly with PCs, XTs, ATs, and compatibles, when you have a short on the power rail, the power supply will shut off to protect itself. So you won't be able to run a computer with a shorted tantalum. So knowing that those often do fail, it is sometimes wise to replace those capacitors, though I think most people just go ahead and wait for them to fail and then replace them as they fail. However, the ones that are the biggest debate are electrolytics, aluminum electrolytic capacitors. They do fail over time. An aluminum electrolytic capacitor is composed of um, two strips of aluminum um, separated by an electrolytic. And that electrolytic is usually a paste or a gel. So over time, that electrolytic will either dry up, in which case the capacitor will lose its capacitance, or in some cases, it will expand and cause the capacitor to bulge and eventually leak. If that electrolytic leaks on your motherboard, it can cause all kinds of corrosion and all kinds of problems. So these capacitors are ones that are of concern for a recapping debate. Um, Typically, these capacitors were designed to have a lifespan of roughly 25 years. And as you know, some of the retro computers that we work with are pushing 50 years old, 45, 40, 45, sometimes pushing 50 years old if you're looking at ones from the 70s. That doesn't mean that the capacitors are bad. Many times electrolytic capacitors will outlive their lifespan by a large margin. I'm betting, for instance, that some of these capacitors that I pulled yesterday are still good. They could have lived in that motherboard a lot longer. However, what you're doing when you're replacing capacitors, when you're recapping a board, is you are essentially extending that board's lifespan. So whenever I'm going to give away or sell a computer after I've worked on it, I will almost always recap that computer, because what I'm doing there is I am future-proofing it and giving a longer lifespan to the person that's going to own and hopefully love that computer. Another reason for recapping, obviously, is if you know a capacitor's gone bad. Further reason would be the reason that we saw yesterday. If you're seeing interference, if you're seeing a lot of jitter, a lot of ripple on your voltage rails, some of that is supposed to be cleaned up by these capacitors. So replacing the capacitors can improve things like your video. Something else I could have done with that board would be to add additional capacitance to the bypass capacitors on the memory. Memory tends to be very noisy. Bypass capacitors help clean that up. So those were, however, ceramic disc capacitors. So the idea of replacing those, well, it can be done. It's probably not necessary. It probably won't improve your situation very much. Possibly adding additional capacitors to those might sometimes be in order, but usually removing the old ones and replacing them is not an issue. Unless, in some cases, I've seen a few instances where the bypass capacitors on the memory were electrolytic, in which case, then it can be a good idea. So my answer to the question of should you recap a board is really it depends on the circumstance. If you have reason to believe that one or more of the capacitors have failed or are starting to fail, then recapping is a good idea. In my case, if I'm going to sell or give away a computer, I want to future-proof that computer for the end user, and I will recap to give them the longest life out of the product as I can. And the other reason would be if you're seeing significant noise in your power rails, recapping might possibly improve that, or possibly changing out the capacitors, not just with a direct replacement, but with a capacitor of possibly a higher value in the case that the original motherboard design didn't clean up enough of the ripple to your liking. So the answer I give is always maybe. Should you recap a motherboard? Maybe. I can't give a definitive yes or no answer to that, and a lot of people sometimes people will want to give a definitive yes or no that you should or shouldn't recap a board. So that all being said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these capacitors that I pulled yesterday and see on this janky little tester here what values they show. This is a 10,000 microfarad capacitor at 16 volts. So let me hook it up here to the tester and see what we're getting. See what this one, I'm betting this one was probably good. I'm showing 10,500 microfarads with an ESR of 0.42 ohms. So this capacitor is actually good, and I'm not surprised. Again, I think the larger capacitors do survive longer, and this is a Nichikan capacitor. So this is a very reliable capacitor. I didn't have to pull that. I'll probably keep that around in my spares just in case. Take a look at the smallest capacitor that I pulled. I don't think I can. I lost the legs on this one, so I'm not going to be able to test it. Let's look at one of these. This is, I believe, yeah, it's a 100 microfarad 16 volt capacitor, and we hook it up. Always remembering, of course, that these are polarized, so I have to give the positive lead there and the negative lead here. Now these weren't near the video circuit, so I don't know that these were causing the problem, but now see, this one is showing 50 microfarads, which it's supposed to be 100. That's not good, and an ESR of 3.8 ohms. So this capacitor is dead. I've got 3 more of those, so I'll go ahead and give them all a test. Excuse my fumbling around. I have not very good fingers for this. This small work is kind of difficult for me sometimes. So this one, again, is supposed to be 100 ohms. Oh, this one's not even registering. Make sure I've got the leads connected right. Try again. Nope. This one's dead. Try the next 100 microfarad. Can't recognize this one either. I'm wondering if something is going on with the tester. So let's try one of the others. This is a 220 microfarad 16 volt. Well, this one was recognized. This one is showing 240.1 microfarads with an ESR of 0.52. So this capacitor is actually still good. I don't think I'll keep this one in my stores, though. Those legs are awfully short. Let's try the big one here. This one is 470 microfarads at 35 volts. $479.9 microfarads at 0.42 ohms ESR. So that one's still good. We have another 220, I believe. And for this one, 241.4 microfarads with an ESR of 0.57, so still good. The last 220. $249 microfarads, 0.53 ohms ESR, so that one's good. Now those 220s and the 470 plus the 10,000 were filtering caps in the power supply. So the power supply portion of the board was actually probably doing its job pretty well. However, these little 100 microfarads, well, those were in the logic side of the board and could have affected the video circuitry. And as you saw already, two of them failed completely, and one of them was out. This one is also out. This one is supposed to be 100 microfarads. It's 51.09 and 3.7 ohm ESR. So all of these little hundreds were pretty bad shape, dead. So that's why when I replaced them, the video did improve to some extent. We cleaned up a lot of the ripple that was going into the video circuitry and therefore creating instability and interference in the video. So you can see there is some value sometimes to recapping. These little guys were a problem. Well, not so much that little blue one. Like I said, I can't test it because its legs are torn off. I had to pick them out of the board. But the others were okay. And that's my take on recapping. Take everything I've just told you with a grain of salt. Use your own experience to make a judgment. But I think there can be value at times in recapping proactively. Definitely value in recapping when you know there's a problem. So that's all I've got to say. So again, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Think about subscribing to the channel. And everybody take care, be well, be healthy, be safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.